Thank you, worship team. I have a question here today, and I'm not trying to get political with this. This is an honest question that comes nothing to do with politics, but from my own personal experience, right? Why do some reporters bother taking notes in an interview when they already wrote the article? What do I mean by that? True story. So I was in the Army, you guys know, and I was stationed over in Germany, and I was military police. And not most of my time, but a lot of my time I rode with the German police, but sometimes I did the regular MP patrols too. And shift is getting ready to start. I got my keys to my vehicle. I get to go in the vehicle, and I get called to the desk sergeant's desk. And I go on up there, I say, "What's up?" And they say, "Well, you got a reporter, and they're going to ride with you for your shift." I don't want a reporter with me for my shift. And they looked at me and said, "Nobody does, but you'll be nicer to her than anyone else." So they put her with me. Now, those of you who have heard some of my story, you know at the time, my first solo patrol on the streets of Mainz, Germany, they handed me the keys to a vehicle, a Colt 45, my 19th birthday was my first solo patrol. I was a young guy, immature, brain doesn't even fully form until you're in your early 20s. I was not ready for this. And pretty quickly, I became very cynical, very angry. I was not serving the Lord my first 2 years in the Army. I was not a particularly nice person, but I was nicer than my coworkers. So they get this reporter in the van, and she starts talking about, "Oh, you must love being an MP." No, I hate it. Every day I see the worst of humanity. Every day I see people that are hurting. Every day I see people that are destroying their own lives and destroying the lives of everyone around them. Well, it must feel really good to help. I don't know that I'm helping much. All I'm doing is slapping on the hand people that are making these choices. Oh, it must feel really good to be in the community. No, the community hates me. There are times, to be honest, I didn't say this to her, but there are times I didn't particularly like them. I was not a nice person. And I won't go through everything that happened that day, but at the end of the shift, she says goodbye, and then she comes out with her article in the local issue of Stars and Stripes 2 days later about what a wonderful thing it is to be an MP. It's so fun. It's just great. And she has this direct quote from me, in quotation marks. Being an MP is wonderful because you get to help people, and that feels real good. And my coworkers are mocking me for it, and I'm getting more and more angry. I thought she only heard that day what she wanted to hear, didn't she? I'm not alone in that. Other people have had that experience. There's a lady, she's an expert in two interesting things, psychology and computers. And she teaches seminars, and she travels around, and her name's Naomi Carten. And she's teaching a seminar one time, and it gets to 11:30 in the morning, and she looks at them, and she says, "Okay, guys, we're going to take a lunch break. You have 45 minutes. Be back in 45 minutes. 11:30, 45 minutes. What time's everyone supposed to be back? What time do they show up? 12:45. Because all they heard was the word 45. And she's getting more and more angry, more and more frustrated. Every single person heard her say 12:45 to be back. They heard what they wanted to hear, right? How many of you have ever been in that situation where you're going, "That's not what I said"? Any of you ever have your experience with that? I think God understands that. If you've ever had that experience and been frustrated, been a little bit like, what is going on? I think God's going, yeah, I get that. I've been there. Because there are times people say, God said this, and you know what? God never said it. So for a little while now, and we've been kind of doing a loose series, not really well structured, not thematic, but we're just looking at some of the different things that people have said in Scripture or said about Scripture that are not in Scripture. And we're calling the series So Close, because these things are so close to being true, but they're not. And they're common beliefs in churches that frankly just sometimes are a little bit off. And that sometimes a little bit off can sometimes hurt people. And we're going to talk today about one of the ones that you've all heard, and I won't make you do it, but I'd be curious to raise hands how many of you have said this one. I hear it all the time. God won't give you more than you can handle. Heavily related to God helps those who help themselves. Let's try to understand this a little bit more. Let's look at what really is going on. To do that, we're going to have to change our mindset a little. We're Americans, we speak English, we live in 2024. We're going to try to go back a couple thousand years, and we're going to try to put ourselves in the mindset of a person who was living in the city of Corinth. You've grown up in this Greco-Roman culture. Now, for those of you who don't know, the Roman culture, the Roman Empire was dominant at this time. Corinth was a Roman city, but the Romans had adopted Greek culture. So it's called Greco-Roman, and people who were non-Jews were called Greeks quite often, even no matter what their real nationality were. If you weren't a Jew, you were a Greek. And if you were a Roman and you weren't a Roman, you were a barbarian. These were just the terms that they used for each other. So, and they're not meant to be derogative, it's just what they called each other. So we're going to try to go back to the mind of a person who was living in the city Corinth. This is 30 years after Jesus walked the earth, say, and you've grown up Greek, and all of a sudden you hear about this guy Jesus, and you start to follow him. You start to think this is the Son of God. So that's our mindset. Now back then, if you were a worker in a city like that, you were going to be in a trade union. There were guilds, essentially. And if you were not in a guild, you cannot work in your industry. If you cannot work, how much money do you make? Okay, just keep that in mind. That's an important fact. So these guilds were extremely important to them, these unions, so to speak. Now the problem is, to be in a guild, you have to participate in the guild. If you're not participating in the guild, then you're working against your own industry. You're not trusted. You're hated. You can see where this is going. To be in this guild, you have to participate in their worship. And some guilds would meet once a month, some on a different schedule, but they would come together and they would have their meetings. And in their meetings, each guild would have their own god. They would have their patron god for their guild, and in their meetings, they would worship this patron god. Now, something that's very hard for us to understand, most ancient religions, especially like in Cana, when the Israelites came in and going through all that, they were what are called fertility religions. And the Roman religions weren't truly fertility religions, but they had some kind of common ancestry, some kind of common roots. In a fertility religion, when you want the god to do something, you demonstrate what you want them to do. So if you want the god to give you crops, you would demonstrate, I want fertility. Or if you want children, you would demonstrate, I want to give fertility. How do you demonstrate to a god? Sex. So sex was often part of their worship. If I want fun times, I might demonstrate by having a party. If I want wealth, I might demonstrate to the gods by bringing wealth and laying it out and displaying it before the god. You show the god what you want in these ancient religions. So when they would come together in these guild meetings, their worship would involve things like having money and receiving pay for your services to the guild, or giving to the guild and giving to the god. There might be a transfer of money. Sexual relations were very common. There is a lot of prostitution in biblical times. It's not always for money. A lot of times it's a form of worship. Hosea is called by God to marry a prostitute. She's a temple prostitute worshiping foreign gods. This was part of their culture. At these things, they would have fancy foods. They would often sacrifice to the idol of their patron god, and then they would eat the meat. Now, meat without refrigeration and everything, that was kind of a delicacy. You don't always get it. So they're throwing on a big feast. I mean, if you're living on a hamburger diet and all of a sudden somebody invites you over for a gigantic New York strip steak, you're going to be like, wow. Imagine you're living on a diet of vegetables and a little fish here and there, and all of a sudden you're invited over for this big old steak at the company party. It's like, this is kind of fun. A lot of drinking, a lot of drunkenness. Their worship was basically a bacchanalia for a lot of this stuff. Now are you getting in that mindset? You have grown up that to worship the gods, you have a drunken party and an orgy. And along comes this guy, Jesus, who says, no, you don't do any of that. And by the way, by not doing that, you lose your income, you lose your family, you lose your friends, you lose your support network. Some churches even want to throw in a little bit of circumcision there. Can you see where people might get a little tempted? Can you see where it would be hard to follow Jesus in that culture? We worry about getting picked on a little. They had a lot more to worry about, and this was before there was government persecution. This was before you're getting tossed to lions in the den, lit on fire in Nero's gardens. It wasn't easy to be a follower of Jesus, was it? Can you imagine the temptation to turn back? So Paul, a lot of Paul's letters are written to people who are facing that sort of life. And a lot of 1 Corinthians is written to people who are facing that sort of choice, that sort of pressure, that sort of temptation every day. So in 1 Corinthians 10, Paul starts to lay out for them, don't go back. And he tells them, you know what, if you're one of God's people, you're going to get tempted because God's people have always been tempted. And he starts to take them back through the history of the Exodus. And he starts to tell them, you know what, they were tempted to worship idols. You know what, when Balaam couldn't curse them, he told Balak, you know what you do, you send women. You send sex as a temptation to them, and they'll turn to that and they'll worship other gods, and their God will turn against them, and it happened. They complained about their food and they searched for other foods. Every temptation, Corinthians, that you guys are going through, you're not the first. Others have been through it too. And Paul walks them through this Exodus story. And he said when they trusted God, they were blessed. When they fell for this idolatry, when they fell for these temptations, God wasn't happy. Corinthians, don't fall into these temptations. Stay close to God. Paul tells them these stories were written as examples for all generations, including us. We also deal with temptations and everything. But Paul is writing them, and he kind of brings it to a head in verses 12 through 13. Now, you guys know my strange habit. Underline words. If you can read the screen, I ask you to say them out loud with me. So Paul writes this to them at the end of this thing. No trial has overtaken you that is not faced by others. And God is faithful. He will not let you be tried beyond what you are able to bear. But with the trial will also provide a way out so that you may be able to endure it. I didn't put verse 12 up here. It said, be careful if you think you can stand because you might fall. Basically what the verse before it had said. Everyone gets tempted. Don't give in to the temptation. And when you're really feeling it, when all that pressure is coming against you and life is getting hard, God will give you a way out. This verse is the origin of the phrase, God won't give you more than you can handle. Is that what it says? Do you think God is sitting every time somebody says that, looking down going, that's not what I said. That isn't it. That isn't it at all. God didn't give anything in this except for a way out. These trials, these temptations, these pains of life, they're not coming from God. And you know another thing? It's not your pain in life that God said you'd be able to handle. It's temptation that He said He'll give you a way out of. I think every time somebody says that phrase, God just goes, no, that's not what I'm talking about. I think every time I hear that phrase, I look at him and I say, well, I wish you weren't so confident in us then. Because we think it's all about we need to be strong enough, and we don't. What does this phrase really come down to? We're going to talk about that, and we're going to talk a little bit about what God really wants in this verse, about temptation. God doesn't give us hardships in life. He doesn't expect us to get ourselves through them by our own power. What does God want? What does this verse say? A few quick observations today. We're going to move quick. God will do His part to keep us close to Him. He didn't want the Corinthian believers to fall back because He knew that was going to rob them of eternal life. He knew that was going to, in the long run, create more pain, not just for them, but for their family, their friends, their neighbors. And He doesn't want them pulled away. He doesn't want us pulled away either. And we still face many of these same temptations. But God also never says it's going to be easy. God never says it's going to be simple to bypass temptation. So in 2016, some of you might remember this, but there was a snowboarder, and his name was Christian Mayers. And Christian, I'm sorry, I don't know a nice way to say this. I don't know a pastoral way to say this, but I don't think he was the sharpest tool in the shed. But he knew how to ride a snowboard. He was good on a snowboard, and he loved some fresh powder. How many of you ski or snowboard or anything? Isn't there something that when you see that fresh powder on that good steep hill, it just calls to you? Isn't there something inside that just says, man, I want to ride that right now? Well, it called him. It called him big time. And so he started to go up from the base, where everyone else is skiing from. He starts to go up to this higher hill, and he passes a sign. This hill is closed. Danger, avalanche warning. And he sees all these signs along the way. But he's got two things he can look at. He can look at that snow, or he can look at these signs. Well, guess where his eyes are going to go? So he starts snowboarding on it, and he creates an avalanche. And that avalanche almost killed him. Yeah. But remember, at the bottom of this hill are all sorts of other people. It almost killed a lot of them. Fortunately, amazingly, nobody died that day. And at the end, they have a video of it. He's just laughing. He thought, man, that was so fun. Well, they arrested him. Hey, what were you thinking? I was thinking that run looked so good. I was thinking that powder looks awesome. I'm thinking that's going to be so fun. There's just a great angle. The scenery is beautiful. I can't wait to snowboard that. Temptation, there's something that pulls on us, isn't there? There's something inside of us that just draws us. Where do we put our focus? On the temptation or all the warnings, because God will give you a way out. And He puts so many warnings to the snowboarder not to go down that hill. He'll put so many warnings in our lives and people around and other places to go. Where do we focus? Where do we look at? And this leads to the second thing. We have to daily choose to stay close to God. It's not that one day we say, oh, I'm a Christian, and all temptation leaves. Every day, temptation's going to start anew. And every day we have to keep going back to God for the strength. Because truth is, if you're anything like me, we're all going to be easily distracted. We're all going to be easily drawn to something. We don't need outside help to get distraction. Some of you who are my age or older will remember Skip or Flip Wilson from the 70s. Devil made me do it. I don't need the devil. I'm perfectly good at sinning all by myself. And I recently stumbled across a Catholic priest that I took an instant liking to. And his name is Father Phil Bloom. And he does some writing, some blogging, and some of his sermons are online and things. And he tells a story on himself. And I love Father Bloom's story. I'm going to read it here, part of it. He says, I remember once I was having a pretty good Lent. I had given up candy and had set aside extra time for prayer and spiritual reading. When I got to Holy Week, now if anyone doesn't know, Holy Week is Palm Sunday through to Easter. That's called Holy Week. And it's Monday, Thursday, Good Friday, all that is Holy Week. When I got to Holy Week, I felt pretty confident. On Palm Sunday, someone gave me an early Easter present, a box of See's chocolates. Remember, he had just given up candy. They are my favorite. I looked at the box and started thinking about which one I would eat first when Easter came. Then I reminded myself that today is Sunday. Sunday's kind of little Easter. And I noticed that some of the chocolates have nuts, which of course are very nutritional. Well, you know what happened. I stripped off the container, the plastic off the container, and I ate one. By the end of the afternoon, I had finished the entire box. That temptation exposed my true self. I am nowhere near as strong as I think. You know what, Father Phil? I ain't either. I'm not as strong as I think either, are you? We need to go to Him daily. What helps us crave Him more than we do the temptations of this world? Those are the things we need to lean into. That's about temptation. There's one other thing I want to just talk to you a little bit about today, just very shortly. God isn't going to abandon us when we feel overwhelmed. This is what is important. This is the harm of that phrase, because that phrase kind of implies, God won't give you more than you can handle. Well, I must be able to handle this. It's on me. If God's giving it to me, the weight's on my shoulders, I must be strong enough to do it, so I just need to press through. I just need to buckle down and do this. No. God says, you're not strong enough, and you know what? That's okay. I am. This pain is too much for you, but that's okay. You don't have to bear it alone. You've got a church around you, and you've got a God that loves you, and we're going to go through this together. You don't have to be strong enough. That is important. Adam Hamilton is a pastor, and he said this, but when you're walking through hard times, it's all right to admit, I can't handle this by myself, and I need help. At times, we need a doctor or therapist to help us. More often, we need family, friends, neighbors, pastors, and brothers and sisters in our church family who come alongside of us to carry us through our adversity. And we turn to God, trusting that God walks with us, that God's Spirit is at work in us and in our life situations, helping us handle all that life gives us. Great ministries out there, one of which is Celebrate Recovery. God willing, we're going to have a chapter for that at our church in the near future. There are some talks happening. Nothing definite yet. Can't announce anything for sure, but it's a very good possibility. We might have it here soon. You know what, guys? Groups like that are just made for people that are saying, I'm not strong enough, but God is. And with the family around, together we can get through things. And it is an absolutely wonderful ministry. Real quick, let me just ask, how many of you have ever cared for a baby, be it your own or somebody else's? You guys know I used to be a foster parent, right? My wife and I were foster parents. Babies are demanding. We had all sorts of babies in. And when they wanted to eat, they would cry. When their diaper was wet, they would cry. They were constantly just like, you know what? I don't care what you're doing right now. I'm tired. I'm taking a nap. And then at 2 in the morning, they'd be like, I don't care if you're trying to sleep. I feel like playing. Come on. Come get me out of here. We had this one baby. All our babies, we had nicknames because for security, we didn't want to use their real names in public. We had one we called Mini Squirt. And my wife will smile back there. Mini Squirt, sadly, was a crack baby. And every morning from 1 a.m. to 2 a.m., he would go through withdrawals. And when he's 2 and 3 weeks old, I would be holding him with his head here and his feet here, and I would pin his arms and I would hold him tight. And as hard as that sounds, as bad as that sounds, that was the only thing that would calm him when he would have his withdrawals and his fits and his seizures. And I would pace back and forth talking to him and singing to him in my living room every morning from 1 to 2 a.m. for about 3 weeks. He was demanding. Did I ever get angry at him? No. He's an innocent, beautiful baby that is hurting. An innocent, beautiful baby that just needs love. That's where he is. That's all he can do. He just needs comfort and peace and prayer. And I pray for that little guy. If I can do that for a baby who's not even my own child, don't you think your God can do that for you? Don't you think when you're hurting, your God can't wrap his arms around you, hold you tightly to him, and say, child, I love you? You're going to get through this, and I'm going to see you through. That's the God we serve. Came across the shirt on Amazon recently. If you can't read, it says, I'm not too big on the first part, OMG, which stands for, oh my gosh, You guys, that's not what I said. And it's a picture of Jesus. I almost picture him coming back for the second coming wearing this shirt. How often have we misconstrued him? He said what he never said. Did what he never did. And how often have we felt like we have to go through life on our own instead of trusting him in our pain? Richard didn't have an easy time in life, but he did have the most unique birthday present I've ever heard of. Richard's mom wasn't really in the picture. Richard's dad was a drug addict, and he spent all his money on drugs. So when Richard hit his 13th birthday, his dad gave him the only thing he had, a shot of heroin. True. Richard went through so much pain, so much heartache growing up. By 19, he was in and out of jail. He loved his dad. He always would say about his dad that, he said things like this, all my life I had been under the impression that my father somehow held secret knowledge as to what it takes to become a real man. I realize now that my father had no idea what a real man is. Most of the time he was absent. And when he was present, he was never sober. Didn't have an easy time. But at 19 years old, facing potential of a very, very, very long prison stay, through God's grace, some legal wrangling, he actually got released from prison. And he went back, he said, no, I need to be locked up. I can't trust myself. And they ended up hooking him up with a Celebrate Recovery kind of ministry there, and he started to thrive. He started to do really well. And he actually became a pastor. And for 10 years, he was clean, working with the people who were hurting, working with those. But the ministry can have a lot of pressures, and the pressures start coming back on him. So he sits down with his dad, who he always loved. He always wanted to please his dad, who's just so far gone with the drugs that his dad isn't thinking. And he says, I'm hurting so bad, I have these terrible headaches. And his dad gave him illegally owned prescription pain pills. Richard fell. He fell again, and he fell hard, and he fell for another 10 years. Now pushing 40, he's again facing prison. And again, somehow, some way, God steps in and he's released. Richard doesn't want to go back. And he started to say to himself, I can't handle this on my own. And he started to realize he doesn't have to handle what God has given him, because God didn't give him this pain, didn't give him this sorrow, didn't give him this difficulty. What he has to do is allow God to handle everything that life is throwing at him. And Richard begins to focus less on the temptations, less on the pain, less on the anger, less on the hurt, and more on Jesus. And he begins to find a God who loves him unconditionally, and he begins to get restored. He's no longer in vocational ministry. He's working another job, but he's doing ministry very actively in a church as a lay leader. And he said in his writings and in his videos, I just want every day to keep my eyes on Jesus. My life now has everything that I once craved. Have to do it all our own. Worship team, if you'd come up. Sorry, guys, I'm running a few minutes late today. But let's close in prayer. And let's close with a song about helping us to trust God and take things to him and not live for the temptations and things behind us. Let's close with this prayer and that song. Father, I thank you so much for your faithfulness, even when life is hard, and for your joy that you set before us. Help us to trust you and put our lives in you, that you would give us all that we need. Pray for this in the name of your Son, Jesus.